Okay, it looks like we are ready for our second session. Thanks everyone for staying with us. And if you are just joining us, welcome to session 2 of day 4 of Evalu8, Fair and Equitable Assessments, Strategies for Working with English Learners. For this session, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Pedro Olvera. Dr. Olvera is a published writer and teaches coursework at Cal Baptist University in the areas of assessment of ELLs, cognitive assessment, and enhancing collaboration with culturally and linguistically diverse families. In addition, he provides clinical support and professional development support with bilingual therapies for clinicians in telepractice. Dr. Olvera has been a bilingual school psychologist in public and private settings for over 21 years. Again, during the presentation, please leave any questions you may have in the Q&A box. A recording of today's presentation and certificate of attendance will be sent to all registrants by the end of next week. And now I will pass it off to Dr. Olvera to get us started.
All right, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Awesome, thank you. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I really appreciate the ability to chat with you guys today regarding fair and equitable assessments and strategies for working with English learners. As some of you guys know, this is an area of passion of mine, and I'm really excited to be here today. So thank you so much for this great opportunity.
Dr. Olvera, before you get started, I'm sorry, did you mean to be showing your face, or right now we're just seeing a orange box?
Oh, okay, 1 second. Sorry, I think my camera is not working. All right, is that better?
No, you're still orange.
Okay, all right. You know what, I'm having problems with my camera. Why don't we just leave the camera off?
That's fine, that's fine.
Yeah, thank you very much. All righty, okay, there you go. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk first. Thank you so much for the introduction. You know, a lot of what I'm gonna talk about today very briefly is about just over 21 years as a practicing school psychologist in Southern California. I practiced about 90 minutes from the border in the Orange County, Los Angeles area. We had high populations of English learners. And I think like a lot of folks that may be on here today, you know, it was really challenging for me initially to try to understand what the difference was, right? The question is always difference or disorder. And I wasn't really trained in understanding the difference, right? All I was trained in, as you know, a lot of friends and I joke, is just, you know, given a nonverbal, and that should give you an idea of you know, these English learners and whether they have a learning disability or not. And that was it, you know. So through time, I was able to develop an approach to assessing students. And you know, fortunately, I've had a lot of opportunity to train many you know, bilingual school psychologists and to really look at that difference or disorder question. So I'm really excited to be here today. A couple of things we're going to look at today is we're going to identify assessment practices that are biased and discriminatory towards English learners. I think these are things that we do inadvertently, you know. So we're going to look at a few items, you know, that would recognize this, the bias aspect of all this. Number 2 is also look at some practices that are fair and equitable. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then also we're going to look at strategies to engage in fair and equitable practices. So these are going to be the 3 main objectives for our training today. So we're going to look at 2 areas as mentioned earlier in terms of bias and discriminatory assessment practice towards English learners. Number 1 is checking our biases. I think that's very, very important to all this. I know a lot of times we look towards, you know, in interacting with many bilingual school psychologists and those that work with ELs, the question always is, okay, what is the best test to give? You know, what should I look at? What are our pattern of scores, right? And there's a lot of questions that come up regarding that. And I'm learning more and more that a lot of it also would have to do with our biases, right? Doing that inner work, you know, really our perception towards English learners, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then also the other piece of it is that disproportionality piece, right? Looking at our school or district-wide data to see, are we over-identifying particular students, right? In this case here for our workshop, our training today, the English learners, right? So let's talk first about these 2 points. So the question becomes, is there a history of biased perceptions of English learners? The Brookings Institute did a study. They looked at, do teachers have biased academic perceptions of their English learner students? Okay, this study conducted in 2019 looked at this very question, which I think is a very valid question, right? And I know this applies to teachers, but I look at it as educators as a whole, right? Let's self-analyze today. They found that EL classification resulted in teachers having lower academic expectations of their students. The effects were modest in size in kindergarten, but grew as students moved to first and second grade, reaching about a quarter of a standard deviation. So according to their study, the answer was yes, right? That they do have lower expectations. And as we talk, I'd like to challenge you guys to think about your particular settings, right? When we hear the term EL, do we automatically have these implicit biases that may influence how we perceive these students? Right? Do we perceive them to be less intelligent? Do we perceive English learners to be is it a handicap, right? To not have full proficiency in English, right? Do we feel that perhaps because our testing may come out, our scores may come out a little lower, right? Because, by and large, a lot of these assessments that we administer, standardized assessments, are not normed on these populations, right? But do we have academic pressure? Do we hear about comments? Do we hear, comments being made amongst our peers in the educational settings, school settings? In terms of equity, right? I think part of our work, that's a lot of work to be done there, right? How do we advocate for these populations? Later, we'll talk about the EL, what some assessment practices will be. But first of all, let's think about some of the perceptions we may hear out there. Salon, again, the Sound of Inclusion article that talked about the sound of why teachers' words matter, right? So again, this article looked at, again, that instructors tend, at all levels of education, instructors often favor students who sound like themselves and can be biased against those who don't. Educators might form negative assumptions about a student's intelligence and ability based simply on how he or she talks, which can result in lowered expectations, stereotyping, and discrimination. Right, so sometimes these messages are sent consciously or unconsciously that a student's language is wrong, dumb, I think that's the word in the article, or out of place at school, right? So again, as we reflect on our day-to-day practice, how does this happen, right? And I'm just thinking over the years, examples that I've seen, right? Just personally, anecdotally, right? But simple things like perhaps a kid's name being mispronounced, right? In a classroom setting, we've heard a lot about that. In many situations, our names are, I was named after my grandfather. Other folks are named after maybe important people in their religious traditions or family traditions, again, and mispronunciation of names. Think about maybe a kid mispronouncing a word, being publicly corrected, students laughing because perhaps they don't have full proficiency in English, and perhaps they're saying maybe a word the wrong way, right? Or mispronouncing a word. Those are just small examples, but just thinking how, perhaps these biases can surface. And I'm not saying that people are bad or are doing it intentionally, but sometimes our implicit biases may take that, right? So again, I think it's important for us to see that piece of it. And how does that carry out into our assessment practices, right? Or maybe special education referral rates, right? Etc. Education Week, again, published an article on this very matter again in 2019. The question was, do English learners, language learners get stigmatized by teachers? A study says yes. The findings indicate that across all the grade levels in content areas, teachers had lower perceptions of the academic skills and knowledge of those who were classified as English learners. Again, this is just hammering the point as to, again, our perceptions of English learners, biases, right? School psychologists, right? How do we interpret our data, right? Our assessment results. Again, the intention of our assessment process is really meant to be an objective process, right? Collectively, having no preconceived notions of the student, collecting the data, right? Talking to parents, teachers, administering standardized norm reference tests, right? In a very clearly objective manner. Again, and then once we get our results, how do we interpret that data, right? So the interpretation piece, do these biases, of these particular students get in the way of our data interpretation, right? Maybe labeling students, maybe placing them in more restrictive settings, right? Again, because of these inner implicit biases we may hold toward these group of students. This Yale study, 2016, even tracked African American students, right? And implicit biases, way down to preschool. In this particular study conducted by the Yale Child Development Center, looked at were teachers watching students more, right? So they looked at African American girls, white girls, African American boys, and white boys, and basically they were tracking the eye movements of the teachers and determining who do we look at more, right? Which students are looked at most, and based on this study, preschool teachers tended to more closely observe Black students and whites, especially Black boys, when challenging behaviors were expected. Again, this is not a phenomenon that occurs in the upper grades, but also down to the preschool level. Are we inadvertently, again, maybe placing these expectations on students, right, or somehow labeling students early on, right? This study seems to think so, way down to the preschool level, right? So again, it's just the power of these biases manifesting in how we treat students, perceive students, right? Again, and interpret behavior, right? How do we interpret behavior? Okay, so a little bit enough of that. So we're going to revisit it in a second, but I want to just briefly talk about the disproportionality as well. So Amanda Sullivan, Dr. Amanda Sullivan published an article in 2011. It's a little older, I understand, but I think we still see a lot of this going on today for the Council for Exceptional Children. And she looked at the identification and placement of English learners, right? Again, they looked at just these trends and these patterns, right, of students who are EL and their placement in more restrictive settings relative to their white peers. This particular study indicated that students ELs are increasingly likely to be identified as having learning disabilities or mental retardation and are less likely to be served in either the least restrictive or more restrictive educational environment relative to their peers, right? So again, how we see these patterns, right, of placement in more restrictive settings as well. So again, we talk a lot about the disproportionality, right? And it could happen both ways, right? I know that in my experience, in working with different districts, some are either over-identifying or others are under-identifying as well, right? For fear of over-identifying students who are English learners, right? So it could happen both ways. Again, this is not a new conversation. I mean, you can pull up articles or even, from like the 1930s, 1940s, 1920s, right? Where these conversations were already happening then, right? They may not have labeled it disproportionality, but they were already calling to our attention that students that didn't have mastery of English were being assessed with tools that required mastery of English. And a lot of them were placed in more restrictive settings. So even 1920s, 1930s, they were already having these dialogues. And, obviously, we have cases like, Diana versus Board of Education, Larry P. right in California, Covarrubias versus San Diego Unified School District, right? That kind of that basically illustrate some of these challenges that we have encountered. So again, it's not a new conversation. Mainstream teachers' implicit beliefs about English learners and implicit association test study of teacher beliefs. Again, this is just again highlighting. So several teachers were administered the implicit association test, and they were looking at their implicit beliefs of or ideas of children who were English learners, right? And again, they looked at some of the outcomes, and again, we do see again just that labeling again, right, of students that are mainstreamed into English classrooms. So ESL students mainstream into English classrooms, and teachers again holding just elevated levels of negative implicit beliefs again, right? So I think it's out there. So I mean, my point in highlighting this is that it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that, and to a couple of questions that I'd like you guys to consider as we discuss this, right? Number one is, do I hold or have I been told that my biases interfere with educational decision making, right? So I think we have, we have several tests. They've been standardized, and I think our tests are obviously a whole lot better than they were, several decades ago. So we have the tools, we have the laws in place, right? But inside of us, are we holding these biases that can interfere with how we interpret assessment data, right? I think it's important for us to do that inner work, right? That self work. The other piece too is I want us to consider is, do we inadvertently assume low intelligence and or disability because of our implicit biases towards ELs? We see that, several studies that were done that demonstrated that. If we were to be honest with ourselves, are we holding some of these beliefs? When we think EL, do we think handicap, right? Disability. It seems to be like, a lot of times lumped up together, ELs and special ed students, right? And inadvertently, we may attribute both, EL to being a disability. To ask, when was the last time you would see, say, for example, in your school setting, a gifted EL student? The identification rate of ELs in gifted education programs is very minimal, right? So I think 1% to 2% last time I checked. So I'm wondering if we see that pattern in our settings, and what can we do to change that, right? Like number one, what can we do to change our mindsets, right? How do we change our mindsets? How do we, instead of check our biases and really see how can we provide supports so that students that are English learner, right, can make, can get the education they need to excel academically. We're going to visit that a little bit later, but again, it's this inner work here. Do we see special education as a means to help? I was a school psychologist, boots to the ground. I understand the challenges, right? I know that in my educational setting, there weren't a lot of options. If a kid didn't qualify for special education, a lot of times the only option was to put him back in a general education, which is the very group that sent them to us for assessment, and because they had run out of options. So I understand there's a lot of challenges there. So I think this is where the advocacy piece comes in, and see, okay, how do we provide supports for these students? Now, as we've heard a lot, in probably the past decade or so, MTSS, early intervention, is really the key to all this. I tell my students, I said, it's very difficult to make the case of say a fourth or a fifth grader who's probably 2 or 3 years below grade level that they don't qualify for special education if it's a language issue. It's very difficult, right, as an IEP team, and I'm sure a lot of you guys can identify with that. How do we make the case for a kid who's in 4th or 5th, a couple years below grade level, that they don't qualify for special ed, right? So I understand that challenge. So as I tell my students, right, I say, at the university, I'm like, we got to really work early on, and that work has to start really, really early, right? In preschool, kindergarten, first grade, we got to get them very early before we see that gap really widen between between their peers and their reading abilities. So we got to really advocate early on for these students, right? So I'm just gonna kind of just put that out there. How do you feel that you can contribute to this, right, to this piece of it? And just the last one, once again, how do we change our mindsets, right? Changing our mindsets about these students. Hopefully the next piece of our presentation here will help us change our mindset. So today, now we're going to look a little bit at fair and equitable assessment practices. So again, number one, there has to be an understanding of that ELs are really bilingual students, and I'll talk more about that, right? ELs are bilinguals. You know, maybe in the educational system here where English only is required, you know, we see the EL students as lacking English proficiency, hence our term, right? English learners. But the reality is that these students are bilingual students. So we'll look at that in a second, right? And again, understanding that would help us understand also some of our assessment practices, right? How we can modify or change them up a little, knowing that. The other piece too is understanding second language development. It's very important to, again, understand that piece of it. We hear it a lot. I'm sure most of us heard it in grad school, right? And we talk about it in different trainings and workshops. But really understanding that second language development piece is important, because knowing where the kids' proficiency levels in English will help us understand, are they really able to access an English-only curriculum, right? So we'll talk more about that. And lastly, validation of assessment outcomes. I'm not going to spend too much time on that piece. I'm going to give you an overview, and I will direct you to another webinar, 2 webinars I did for Riverside Insights, where I talk more in depth about the validation of assessment outcomes. But I think that's a very important piece as well that we got to also consider. So let's look more into these pieces. So Dr. Oler D. Kimbrough did a study, wrote an article, and looked at the concept of what we would consider distributed characteristic in bilingual learning, right? So what he argues is that a student who is considered English learner is really a bilingual student, right? Now, for those of you who perhaps learned English at a later age in life, you may be able to identify a little, right? Where perhaps your proficiency in your home language was either minimal or even advanced, right? But while you're learning the second language, you have obviously minimal proficiency in the second language. You're still an English learner. So you come from 2 languages. But what he argues is that language is actually distributed, right? Where we are actually, bilinguals are actually sort of two languages in one. You may know some languages and some words in one language, but not the other, and vice versa. So if I'm testing you and I'm asking you to tell me for example, what a muffler is in a car, right? So a muffler, right? You may not know it in English, but you can definitely tell me in Spanish, right? So, you know what a muffler is, you know exactly what it is, but you just can't tell me in English. You know it in your home language, right? Vice versa, you may be able, because you've gone to school here, and you may have a particular vocabulary in English, but if I ask you in Spanish, you may not know it in Spanish, right? But you know it in English, right? So what he's saying is that, and I highlighted here, it says, thus it can be said that lexicalized concepts of the bilingual are distributed across 2 languages, such that concepts are lexicalized in one language but not the other, and vice versa. Now think about how that translates into testing. For the most part, our assessment tools were standardized and normed for the most part in one language. Now, if I'm not able to share with you, you may ask me a question, but I'm not able to tell you, say, for example, in English, the answer to the question, but if you were to ask me in Spanish, I knew it, you would give me a 0, right? Vice versa, you may say, okay, I'm going to test this person only in Spanish and only accept Spanish answers. Perhaps I know it in English, but I don't know it in Spanish, right? You can see how that could impact our testing results. So this idea of distributed characteristics is important for us to keep in mind as we think about the English learners that we're working with. Dr. Elizabeth Pena is another individual who's done a lot of work in this area. She's a speech and language pathologist at UC Irvine, and she's done a lot of work with the with kids who are considered English learners or bilingual students in the Southwest. And a lot of her work has pointed her to the same area, saying basically that we need to consider both languages, not necessarily both languages separately, but at the time of assessment, consider both languages. This is what, and you know, I really encourage you, if you work with these populations and are having questions about your assessment results and what do they mean, Dr. Pena has a lot of work in this area. In this particular article she wrote, it's assessment of language impairment in bilingual children using semantic tasks, 2 languages classified better than 1. And basically what she's saying is for the most accurate assessment and diagnostic decision making for bilinguals, i.e. English learners, approaches that consider both languages together are recommended. Now what she's saying is that yes, there's a time and a place to assess L1 only, right, in a standardized fashion, and there's a time to assess L2 only in a standardized fashion, but also there's a time and a place to assess both languages in a fluid manner, right? So together at the same time, right? Someone knowing both languages is important at this point, right? Because I'm able to do a sort of a fluid bilingual assessment. Yes, it's out of standardization. I understand that. I get that, right? However, again, it's important to consider that piece, right? Because some students are going to know some words in one language, but perhaps not the other, right? So we want to give them that opportunity to be able to respond in such a manner, so we can totally understand what their full range of abilities are. So I want to give an example. This is an example that I've been given that I find very helpful, right, in explaining this concept of distributed language. So again, this is proficiency in one language. Perhaps many of us grew up in a home where only one language was spoken, right? Let's say, for example, English only, right? So you're starting kindergarten, right, with pretty much a full cup of water, right? The water represents language, right? How much language you have. All other things being equal, right? Let's say that there's no speech and language impairment, no disabilities. You're coming to kindergarten, right, with a full cup of water, right, for your age level, right? Research shows us to be successful in an English-only classroom, you're looking at having about a vocabulary of about 3,000 words is what they look for, right? About 3,000 words to be successful in a entry-level kindergarten classroom, right? Some students are coming with proficiency in 2 languages, right? Those are fully bilingual individuals, right? That's another profile. Some individuals may have both L1 and L2, and they're able to be very proficient and go back and forth between 2 languages. This type of profile here is really what the goal of a dual immersion program is. So if you're in a state or a district where you have a dual immersion program, this is what they want to produce, right? People who are fully bilingual, meaning they're able to read and write, speak, listen, right, in 2 languages, right, fully. And these programs have, as I'm sure you're aware, have provided a lot of success, right? In fact, in some states, they've seen this as perhaps a possible means to decrease the overrepresentation of English learners in special education, right? Because we're using their primary language, right, to teach them the second language. Now, the challenge with this type of program is that it's a very disciplined program, right? It requires a lot of effort, not only on the school, but on the family, on the student, right? Because you really got to immerse yourself in both languages, right? Not just at school, but at home and in your community, right? All around, you really got to immerse yourself in that second language for this to work. I worked with many families, and I worked at schools where they had the dual immersion program, and it's not going to work if there's not full commitment, right? There was nothing for me sadder than working with the students, say sometime around 5th or 6th grade, and they're just not picking up the other language, right? And now they're really struggling, they're failing, now they're up for assessment. Is there something wrong with the student? But when you really look at the context and the environment, it's like, wow, it's a commitment. It's a very, very, very thorough commitment on all environments. And if that commitment's not followed, it could look like a disability, right? Because they're not achieving academically, but it really isn't. It's just that they didn't follow the program with fidelity, right? But either way, this is what they're individuals that graduate from a program because they're fully proficient in both languages. And I think this is awesome when it works, right? The program. But you also have students that come in with uneven levels of proficiency. They may come with a very strong home language here, L1, enter kindergarten with very limited L2, right? I think of myself here. I grew up in a home where my parents spoke Spanish, right? They were first generation immigrants from Mexico, and they spoke Spanish in the home environment. And my family and my cousins, we all spoke Spanish to each other. However, I also had some English because my neighbors spoke English. I had a few neighbors that I spoke English with only, right? Because that's all they spoke. And in fact, it's interesting to hear my dad. I don't know where it's at now, but he had a cassette tape of where he recorded me in a conversation with my friend speaking English, and this was sometime around kindergarten. And it was kind of cool to hear, like, just my development of. I was probably like, I don't know, 4 or 5 years old or so, and it was interesting to hear me speaking at that age, right, with my friend who spoke English, right, and it's just kind of cool to see that. But either way, I went into kindergarten like this, right, with a lot of Spanish and some English. Now, I'm competing, if you remember the first cup slide, I'm competing with students that come in with full cups, right? So my English is going to look a lot less because most classrooms, not all classrooms, but most of them are equipped for students that only speak English, right? They assume English only proficiency on the first day of kindergarten. And if I'm an English learner and I don't have that level of proficiency, then I'm going to struggle, right? And from day one, I'm playing catch up. Because if the standard is about 3,000 words in kindergarten, and I'm coming in with, say, 1,000 words, I'm already at a 2,000 word deficit. What the other kid had 5 years to gain in an English only home, 3,000 words, I didn't have that. So I have to catch up, right, with those 2,000 words. Think about how that's going to look in a educational academic setting. I'm going to have difficulties perhaps contributing to classroom discussions, perhaps engaging with my peers, right? Socialization as well with my peers. And perhaps I'm going to be little by little isolating myself or being isolated from the curriculum, not accessing the curriculum, right? Because I don't have the language abilities, right, to keep up with an English only curriculum. Now, the beauty of all this is that a kid who has a very full, almost full cup in their L1 is going to be a future strong bilingual, right? They just got to fill the cup up. They just need the supports in place to help them out. But what I want to show you here as well is these are bilingual kids as well. In an English only classroom, this is all we look at, this cup here. We ignore this cup because really there's not a lot of use, or we don't know how to, as educators, use this full cup here, right, to leverage the second language. So this is all we see, right? This is all we see. But I think hopefully as we lead this today that you would also see that the English learner student is really a misnomer, right? That really we are looking at bilingual students, right? Multi-language students with limited proficiency in one of their languages. Doesn't mean no proficiency, it means just limited proficiency. And how does that carry over in testing, as we said earlier, right? Where perhaps I have some words in this cup that I can express in this language because it's not in this cup yet, right? And I have some words in this cup that may not be able to be expressed here. But if you were to allow me both options, perhaps I would look better, right, on these assessment results, right? Which is what Dr. Elizabeth Pena looked at when she said, that it's better to use both languages, right, in our assessment practices. Other students, again, come in with minimal proficiency in both languages, right? Over the years, I've heard terms like semilingual or alingual students, which is really a negative term for these students, right? It assumes no language or language handicap somehow, right? And I think we gotta change our terms and look at them as more students who have limited proficiency, right? Because not all kids are going to come even from their home. I mean, there's kids that come from their families, right, where they're speaking both languages in their families, but they're not fully proficient in both languages, right? It's not unusual, especially among the Southwest where I'm at. I'm literally about maybe 10 minutes from the border, from the Mexican border. We go back and forth a lot here. Growing up, I grew up in San Diego. I grew up going back and forth a lot, probably twice a week to Mexico, right? Crossing the border back and forth. So we kind of really don't always master both languages because we're constantly going back and forth between two languages. And as you all know, the languages we learn in our family, social is big, right? So we're not really getting a lot of academic language. We're just a lot of social. So we may look very limited in both languages. But in reality, all we need is just some support to learn that second language, right? So again, look at these students as bilingual students that may just have minimal proficiency. And what can we do to fill those cups, right? To get those cups higher. And I understand that sometimes the school system is not equipped to do that. And again, when we test ELs in only one language or expect them to function in a classroom where full proficiency is required, again, this is how they look here, as I mentioned earlier, right? This is how they look. We're totally ignoring this piece here. And unfortunately, this piece here can leverage and help them fill this cup here, right? So we got to look at how this sort of plays out and hopefully give us a positive view of these students. So a couple of things to consider here as we're done with this section. Number one is, how will your perception of ELs change when considering them bilinguals? Right? Remember, these are in fact bilingual students, right? We got to look at them that way and change the narrative, right, in our teams of who these students really are, right? Advocacy. Just very briefly, I've had situations where I've tested students who look very minimal, right? So limited cups, right? Water in their cups. So when you tested them with English only and Spanish only instruments, they looked very limited because they didn't have proficiency in either, right? So everyone was always worried about, wow, they are very limited in their proficiency. We can't really support them. How can we help these students, right? But when you take a bilingual approach to testing these students, where you allow them to use both languages, it's interesting to see how their abilities change, right? I had a student that I worked with that was very limited in Spanish only, English only testing. Probably his scores were around the 60s or 70s, very limited. But when I provided an assessment of his standardized assessment, but I used a bilingual approach, so testing the limits, right? Outside of standardization, I understand that. But I read questions in English and Spanish. I allowed him to answer me English and Spanish, right? I gave him more time to process because, as you guys know, if you're learning a second language, if you're hearing a discourse in a language that you're not fully proficient in, it's a lot more difficult, so you need more time to process. The student did considerably better, right? He went from probably scores that were like 60s, 70s to like 80s and 90s, right? It made a big change when I understood and then I communicated to the team, this kid is bilingual, allow him to answer in both languages for now, right? Until he reaches full proficiency in English. And the team agreed. They thought, they totally saw. Now, it didn't change his placement, it didn't change the label, but it did change the fact that this kid was seen from a positive lens. I know our previous speaker was talking about positive psychology, hacking, deficit thinking. That's what happened here, right? We were able to see the kid from a positive lens, which I thought was awesome. And again, how will your assessment practices change knowing that bilingual children have language distributed in their L1 and L2, right? The research is clear. And not only, we don't have to always just look to the research, but to our personal experiences if you learn another language. How many of us can identify with that, right? Where you were learning another language and you just don't have the word in. They ask you a question, but you don't have the word in the moment. It doesn't mean you don't know it. It just means you know it in your primary language, and that's what Spanglish is, right? We're able to, or other languages as well that you could do both, right? Where maybe you don't have the word in the moment, but you say it in Spanish, okay, I got it out. But if you don't have an outlet to do it, then it seems like you don't know, right? And I'm hoping that this could somehow impact our assessment practices on how we handle these students. Let's look at the last piece. Again, commitment to data. Okay, identify strategies to engage fair and equitable practices in clinical practice. So this is what I want to do. I want to just briefly cover this. The first point, which is a commitment to data validation, right? No one said that working with English learners is going to be a quick and easy process. It's going to take more time, right? Because we have more variables. When you think about a monolingual only student versus a student who speaks 2 languages, by nature, we're considering more variables, right? So it's going to take more time, and I know that amongst my peers and those who are bilingual school psychologists, I'm on different Facebook pages where this dialogue occurs, one of the big things is, well, we feel that we do more work and we don't get paid enough, right? Because we feel that we're doing more, taking more efforts in the assessment. And I would think that there's some truth to that, right? It's just like, if you're working with a kid that has a lot of other variables to consider. So a commitment to validation is going to take longer, but I'm hoping that through going through these steps, you're able to validate your results, right? To ensure that the scores we're getting with these students are accurate. And then also I want to talk about personal and systemic strategies, right? That we can commit to, hopefully. So one quote I want to guide us today as we do this piece is, our problems are not with the data itself, but arise from our interpretation of the data, right? And that kind of is what I talked about earlier, personal biases, etc. But also I think it's very applicable as we validate our data, right? So kind of keep this quote in the back of your mind as we go through the next pieces. Another thing I want you to keep in mind is that standard scores are just the tip of the iceberg. I know as a school psychologist, I like the fact that there was a lot of numbers because it made matters easier for me with a lot of numbers. I subtracted, I added, I looked at patterns of numbers, right? And then I was able to make decisions based on that. But it's more than that. Numbers, as you all know from grad school and from your day-to-day practice, it's the tip of the iceberg. These are standard scores up here. There's a lot more to the story, right? And we got to look down here to ensure that these numbers are really telling us what we think they're telling us, right? I'm very confident, right, that all the tests we use, the Woodcock-Johnsons, the different standardized assessments, they've all undergone some very rigorous reviews and validity, right, processes, and we know that they really spend a lot of time in the statistics and ensuring that we get valid scores, right? So I'm not concerned about that. So I think this score is telling us something, but we don't know what it's telling us until we look underneath, right? So keep in mind that standard scores are just the tip of the iceberg. So I want to define data validation as the process of ensuring the accuracy and the quality of the data for educational decision making, right? We got to make sure that we have a good process in place to make sure that our data is accurate and also that we have good quality, right? Because at the end of the day, we're either going to label the student, right? I hate to use that word, but we're going to find them eligible or not. We're going to determine services or not. We're going to determine placements or not, right? Based on the data. So we want to make sure that our data is solid, right? Now, we're going to get these outcome scores, but again, we want to make sure that those outcome scores are really telling us information that is grounded in several variables that we want to consider in a second. But we want to make sure that we could trust those numbers, right? That they're really telling us what we think they're telling us. So let's go to some process very briefly. There's a couple of factors. Now, this looks very loud and chaotic, this sheet, but I wanted just to give you just a heads up that I did do 2 webinars on validation of data. So if you go into the Riverside Insight webinars, there's one called the standard score is just the tip of the iceberg, validating your data in the assessment of English learners. And that was held on Wednesday, April 23rd. I'm sure you can't see it too well, but if you go into the platform of Riverside Insights, you'll see it there. And then a week later, I did another webinar. It's called Choose Your Own Adventure, an EL case study on data validation interpretation, where we revisited the different factors and then applied a case study to see how it would look. So this part here, I'm going to go very briefly, I'm going to go very quickly through it, but I do want to encourage you to go to the other 2 webinars if you want a more in-depth analysis of each of the factors. So these factors that I include here are steps that you consider along the interpretation of your data. So once you get your score, you assess the student, right? You reviewed records, you've done all that, the riot, right? Now you have these scores and you want to validate them. It's okay. Can I trust this or not, right? Can I make good decisions on this? Or are these scores just telling me that something's missing, right? Scores, a lot of times I see them as temperature, right? They're telling you something, but it could tell you something that perhaps is missing or something that you need to add, or perhaps that score is legit, right? You can make decisions on them. Couple of things. Number one is the first factor to consider is, have you done a thorough investigation of context and background information, right? Again, this is where you spend time with the parents. Have you spoken to the parents, right? Looked at their developmental history, reviewed educational medical records. This is where we have to make sure that all that's in place. Now, I think it's important to consider the context as well, because, you know, disabilities start early on, right? You could talk to a parent and they'll tell you, yeah, when Bobby was 3 years old, he wasn't speaking yet. Bobby was not, I had to repeat myself because Bobby wasn't really understanding, right? Or Bobby didn't walk till he was like 2.5 years old, right? You know, disabilities don't occur like, you know, when you start school, right? There's a pattern there. Or Bobby's uncles, you know, 5 of them had dyslexia, right? So we're looking at all that. So we want to establish that there's a history and a context there, a background that you can say, okay, you know what? I see why the score is this, right? Perhaps, right? Number two is an analysis of language of instruction and academic supports. You got to really look at, have they had the academic environment to be able to access the curriculum, right? You know, it's about that prior knowledge piece, right? If I'm going to ask you what a toga is, right? Or I'm going to ask you what, you know, what that an exhaust manifold is, have I had the opportunity to know what that is? Have I gone to school? Has it been covered in my curriculum, right? Have I had language of instruction as well, right? Have I had supports to learn English, right? So, you know, these are the pieces that are very important in all this as well. Again, so if I'm looking at my outcome scores, well, if a student hasn't had second language instruction, and hasn't had the appropriate academic supports, then perhaps the scores that I'm looking at are not really telling me what I'm thinking. Maybe it's just telling me that I need to provide more supports there. So language of instruction is very important. Academic supports, right? Dual immersion programs, right? Structured immersion. Look at their supports. And does it help you feel more confident or less in the scores? Again, analysis of evidence-based interventions. Have they had opportunities to have interventions that have targeted their areas of concern? Were they linguistically appropriate, right, as well? Right, so again, if I haven't had those interventions, then again, remember, interventions are basically, at the end of the day, very good teaching, right? Teaching with fidelity, based on tools that have been replicated and have shown to work, right? And this is going to help me tease out whether the kid just had skills deficiency issues or true disability, right? So are they responding to those interventions? Is there a history there as well? So we're doing our investigations and all that. Again, helping us determine if the scores we get in our standardized are strong or not, right? How do they compare to relative progress to similar peers, right? So again, how do they compare to similar peers? Remember, a lot of our standardized tests are comparison to English only or fluent English proficiency students, right? So if I'm an English learner, right, and I'm like at a CALP level, say 2 out of 5, and I have minimal proficiency, and you give me a WISC or another test that's English, and I'm not going to do so well on that, because you're comparing me to students that are English only or fluent English proficient, right? It's not a fair comparison. So compare me to students that have my similar background and to see if my progress or my level is similar to others, right? That share my same experiences. So those are the local norms, or just looking at the classroom, right? What do the classroom grades look like, talking to the teachers, spending some time there. Number 5, again, looking at, language proficiency and dominance, right? Woodcock-Johnson oral language, Woodcock-Johnson Munoz, right? Language survey, right? Those are very reputable tools that help us answer that question. And the reason why I like those tools is because if a kid is in an English-only classroom, for example, and they are accessing English-only curriculum, those tools give me whether they have the sufficient proficiency in English to access an English instrument or English curriculum, right? So if I have a level 2 CALP level and I'm in an English only class, it's going to tell me whether they if it's going to be hard or not, right? You can, they have different descriptors that are attached to different CALP levels that are going to tell you whether accessing the curriculum for them is difficult or not. You know, it's kind of hard to make the case that I have a learning disability if my proficiency in English is very low, that it's so difficult or almost impossible for me to access the curriculum. So language proficiency and dominance against is important in all this. Are we selecting, again, culturally, are the tools culturally linguistically appropriate, right? Again, to answer the referral question, right? Again, we talked about the linguistic, do they match the kid's language, right? Again, is there any cultural bias perhaps in the tools that we should be considered of, right? And the procedures as well. And that's where that whole piece of our personal biases come in. Are our procedures free of bias, right? And are they answering the referral question? 7, consideration of acculturation factors. Again, cultural validity, very important here, right? Are there, maybe, again, variables that may be, time factors. Some cultures process time differently than other cultures, right? Maybe my interaction with the examiner, right? Am I even, another thing, am I even, as an examiner looking, into the family, are there other things the kid does very well, right? Maybe they're very in tune with their culture, cultural traditions. Maybe they're not looking so good on my testing, but maybe there's other things that we can ask the parents to see how well they do within their cultural context, right? So think about, some cultures are very big on art, very big on music, very big on maybe perhaps dance, right? Am I looking at these other factors that are probably not really captured in the testing as well? Finally, are we looking at accommodations, right? So again, the test companies, like if you look into the Woodcock Johnson tools, they give you certain accommodations that are allowed, right, for testing. So things like perhaps extra time, perhaps repeating certain items, right? Are we incorporating the accommodations that are allowed, right? Again, remember, if I'm an EL, I'm gonna process slower. Like I give the example, I watch news in Spanish and I process a whole lot slower. I'm proficient in Spanish, but if you give me English news, I process it a whole lot better than the Spanish, right? So again, there's certain variables that may be present as an English learner that these accommodations, which are very legit, are recommended by the test publishers, may help me overcome in my testing. Now, I know this is a real quick review of this validation process. I want to direct you to the other 2 webinars that were done. But again, this is just that other step we want to take, right? Looking at all these variables to see if these scores that we're getting at the end are truly giving me what I think they're giving me. Lastly, as we kind of close off, this is the validation process, but these aren't things that come in overnight. I look at it as an ongoing commitment to professional development, right? So we got to be committed to professional development, being in tune with the legal and the ethical, being in tune with second language development, being in tune with the latest supports and interventions, being in tune with your tools and really understanding your tools, right? To know which are the best tools and what these accommodations are for your ELs. And also being in tune with self-knowledge, right? Being aware of ourselves and our biases. I see this as sort of an ongoing wheel that's going to help us with the data validation process, right? To be able to examine the variables we considered earlier, right? And to, again, ensure appropriate interpretation of the data as well. Lastly, I want to just kind of challenge you guys as we end today. I want to challenge you to a couple of things, right? As we move on and kind of close this with the equity theme, right? Personal, again, I want to challenge you to personal commitment to cultural competence and humility, right? Again, working with families of different cultures may involve that we step outside of our comfort zones, maybe into the unknown, right? Every cultures have different traditions, different beliefs, right? So really stepping into the unknown and having an attitude that of commitment to learning and being humble and not coming across as the expert, right? But coming across as a learner in the process. So I want to challenge you to that. Also, again, as we talked about earlier, reflection on personal biases. that self-awareness, right? These preconceived notions that we may come with that may somehow impact how we interpret our data, right? So we got to be very, very well versed in that. As I just spoke about earlier, again, commitment to staying current with the research, to best assessment practices, and continual self-reflection. Also, connecting with peers that are committed to equitable assessment practices. Sometimes as a school psychologist, I felt alone, right? We like to say we're like silos, we're our own. Commitment through Facebook, right? Paid groups, there's a lot of awesome ones out there. People in your school district, right? Because I think the only way we can make positive change is by uniting our forces and collaborating with others. So again, uniting with other folks that may have the same beliefs as us. Systemically, again, I think it's important for us to advocate for evidence-based interventions that have been validated for ELs, right? I know a lot of folks that I've spoken to over years, they feel that they're not being supported, that the EL populations are not supported in their districts. They say they don't have the tools, they don't have the interventions, right? So again, advocacy there. Advocacy for hiring a bilingual, bicultural school psychologists and interpreters, I think, are also important. We talked about that distributed aspect to language, right? Again, and folks that can connect with the families, again, and interpreters as well. Cultural brokers, I think we call them now. Advocacy, again, for culturally, linguistically appropriate tools and practices. Again, when it's that time of year to ask for new assessment tools, right? What about, again, the advocacy for culturally, linguistically appropriate, the word called bateria, the academic, the cognitive, right, are great tools, the Munoz, right, to help us with these populations. And then awareness of EL identification rates in your districts, right? Sometimes we're working, we're plugging away, but we're not seeing how we are identified. What do our rates look like? So if your state or your district has that data available, I think it's important to us to know where we stand in all that, right? Because it may cause us to reevaluate some of our practices. Last but not least, again, I think it's important to enhance homeschool partnerships through respectful relationships. Kind of touches on the first one, but I think as a school, as a system, it's important for us to partner up with parents, right? And to work together, right? We both want the same thing. As educators and parents, we want kids to succeed, right? To go on to have successful lives, right? So how can we enhance those partnerships? Respectful, treating parents as experts in their children, right? And even providing the parents with the tools so they could provide the support in the home environment, right? When we talk about parental involvement, there's a lot of research out there that looks at different cultures' definition of parental involvement and the schools. And a lot of times we're on different pages. We don't identify parental involvement in the same manner. So I think through these homeschool collaborations, respectful relationships, we can work together, right? And have a very effective team that can help students succeed. And this leads us to the end. I really appreciate your time and this opportunity, and hopefully we can walk away with a few things here that can hopefully positively impact your practice. So thank you so much, and I wish you a great rest of your day. And again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Olvera, for that information. Some really important considerations as we're thinking about working with English learners. I would like to thank everyone for attending, and we hope to see you at one of our interactive sessions tomorrow. The information for registering those will be in the chat. We have sessions for digital assessment, best practices in evaluation, and student-centered SEL. This is a great way to dive deeper into these topics and get your questions answered by thought leaders in these areas. As a reminder, all participants in our Evalu8 conference will be entered into a raffle to win a test battery of their choice. The winner will be notified following the conference. And one last thing, also in the chat, you will find a link to join our LinkedIn group, Psych to Psych, a Riverside Insights Network. We created this to be able to connect you with the speakers that you heard or will hear from this week and other clinical practitioners. You can join this forum, insights, ask for support, and continue conversation on important topics. Thank you again for your attendance. Check those links in the chat and have a wonderful rest of your day.